All right. Hello and welcome to History Chats. There we go. Yeah. Well, shoot. I always forget to turn off the video that I'm watching to make sure that the stream works, and then I hear myself. It spooks me out. Anyway, hey, happy Thursday once again. That's not something I usually say, but I said it here. We're doing a story about Colby today, which is an interesting situation as being situated on the county line between Marathon and Clark County, but also has the distinction of being the first, the first city, second city to be established in Marathon County as well as in Clark County, which makes it kind of interesting. I've been surprisingly doing a bunch of programming. I say surprisingly because in the past we haven't done as much, but I did in the past couple months programs in Dorchester, Abbotsford, and actually just a few weeks ago, I had a chance to do a program in Colby itself. This is from the Colby Rural Arts Museum, and they and their public library had me out talk about railroads. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is, Colby is in one of those communities like Abbotsford, like Dorchester and Unity, to an extent like Marshfield, where because of the dual nature of being in a city or a village that is in both counties, it's a little different. And it has caused me to think of, what does it mean to be a city differently than when we're just talking about, Mosinee and Schofield and Wausau, right? So I thought it was an interesting thing to do, and so we're gonna talk about Colby. I think it's worth starting. Colby gets started. I mean, it's hard to figure out, like, where does Colby get started, right? Like, at what point do we say that there is a Colby, a community there? It's not in the 1850s and the 60s. This is a map from 1864, and as we zoom in, you can see, first of all, obviously, we're still figuring out a lot of this. If you look at obviously, Marathon County doesn't go to the county line or the state line anymore with Michigan. Still figuring it out. There's not as many people here as evidenced by the sort of vague direction of just like the lakes and rivers up here. And even down where we have surveyed in Marathon County, they know that, like, hey, there's a river that goes out, westward, a couple of them, but they don't really have a good, like, just kind of vague squiggles, right? It's probably better to find around the river, obviously, because people have been traveling there, less well-defined out in where we meet with Clark County. And in fact, there are no communities here. There's no points on the map, partially because of these rivers, although, it doesn't make really a big distinction. And here, I guess I should make a point of doing this. Hopefully that's a little easier. It doesn't make a distinction between the Wisconsin River, which is a pretty substantial river, and some of these branches of, like, the Big O Plain, which aren't quite as substantial. I just put it that way, and maybe not the basis for something you want to maneuver around. So we don't really see a community really getting started here until a little bit later. But something starts to change, and the first thing that the big thing, of course, is the railroad. Specifically this one. The Wisconsin Central gets started in, there's a complicated history, but essentially in the 1871, they have completed their first route in their sort of larger attempt to connect Ashland to Menasha. This was sort of the route that had been established by the federal government, saying, hey, if you connect these two places, we'll offset the cost and by giving you a lot of money. So they need to do this. They get the first route to Stevens Point. In 1871, they start out to build from basically down from Ashland and then up from Stevens Point. And there's a little bit of discussion about whether or not, where the route's going to go. If you go back to the map, I guess I can show. I didn't really crop this well for this, but, you could go up to Wausau, right? That was discussed. Probably would have been a jut, because the better way would be to go over, and then even though the county line between Marathon and Clark County is kind of an arbitrary, it just happens to be 6 miles east of the 4th principal meridian, which is this here. You can kind of see the line just to the left of where Marathon County is. It also happens to be not a bad place to actually build a railroad. So you have them set out. Some of the first, I'm going to use this term very loosely, roads that are cut through the wilderness are by the railroad to supply their engineers, their forward, to kind of get the route ready to go. And so they had a little camp that was there around 1871 to 72, somewhere in there, in what is now Colby. This is an interesting account. This is from the town of Hull, had a history book in which they talk about the early development here. I'm also going to be using this book, Colby, Wisconsin, their Centennial book from 1973 for a lot of this. They start out by talking about this endeavor as well. This is George Holton, who is going to come up here at the end of in like November of 1871, just to see the route. He's going to be accompanied by H.A. Ferguson, who ends up kind of having the expertise. Ferguson is going to end up settling near what is now Weston. But Ferguson, apparently, as they come up the area to kind of see where the railroad's going to go and kind of look at the land, and I'm not sure exactly what their intention was, if it was just curiosity or if they were looking as like a business venture. But apparently, they already found a number of people, particularly the brothers of the Tennant family and a man named Rufus Baker, sorry, who had already started to kind of develop the land and kind of like claim a homestead. They didn't really have the ability to like know how to survey it or file the claim for the homestead, and apparently. Ferguson and his gold soul, whatever they called him, took it upon himself to do the work. Now, I couldn't find, this is apparently a handwritten account from Holton about this experience. I can't find any places where the Tennants or the Bakers actually ended up. I didn't spend that much time, but I looked through some of the early plat maps and stuff and couldn't see them. But Holton, I do have. He's one of the first to homestead this area. Now, Holton's homestead is actually north of Abbotsford, though, so it's not really, really Colby yet. It's kind of just in the general, but you can see there are people starting to come with the railroad. And as they go, they get to the 51st section. I think this is using the surveying terms, like the 51st mile of track of this section. But whatever the case might be, they started calling, as they would build, they would make these stops along the railroad. And then those stops end up becoming, depots and supply, watering stations and things like that. The 51st station was pretty significant. They kind of develop a little depot there, and it's this stop of the railroad which become the hub for the community, and therefore very soon become Colby. Now, there's a little bit of discrepancy about when they adopt this name and who they adopt it for. The two biggest names by 1871, the two main figures of the railroad, was Gardner Colby on the left there, and he is the financing guy. He kind of takes it over. These guys didn't start the railroad. They kind of took over some other nascent railroads and kind of turned it into, really getting things going. Elijah Phillips, on the other hand, is going to be responsible for actually like doing the work to build the railroad. Now, both of these guys are out east. Neither of them are local. You might think Gardner Colby is the head of the company. He would be the namesake. But if you actually, look at the Colby history and some of the other sources out there on the internet or wherever, it's actually credited as being his son, Charles Colby. Now, interestingly, Elijah Phillips, I'm not going to get too deep into this story. It's interesting. But Elijah Phillips in particular runs into some really tough issues, like some scandals. Turns out that railroad people in general are maybe not the most scrupulous businessmen. And so maybe some corruption, maybe some professional dealings. So he kind of gets forced out. Gardner Colby doesn't seem to be getting the direct pressure, but he does kind of step away by 1874, 75. And largely it's going to be Charles Colby, his son, who steps up to kind of keep things moving, as well as Edwin Abbott, who, fun fact, becomes the namesake of Abbotsford, right? A lot of the places along the county line and subsequently, like where the railroad went through, are named after places in the vicinity, or either people associated with the railroad or named in the vicinity of Boston, where these guys got their start. Whether it is Charles Colby or whether it is Gardner Colby, Colby becomes an important name. Now, they initially thought that the spot that becomes Colby, the city, was going to be the point at which they were going to move west. They end up moving that up to Abbotsford later on. Originally, they were just going to go all the way up to Ashland, right? But they knew that they had this opportunity to then connect and get more traffic by going west towards, you know, the Twin Cities and you know, St. Paul, Minneapolis, the Chippewa Valley, that sort of thing. It ends up being in Abbotsford, but Colby is still kind of important. And so, whatever the case might be, we know that the town of Colby emerges alongside the town of Hull in Marathon County around 1873. So these are separate. Up until this point, there were just kind of large swaths of land. Now, as there are more people, I mean, what this tells us is that by the end of 1873, there are indeed going to be people living here to the point where they need to separate a new town. And this is the first step, like a subdivision for the local population within the counties, respectively. So the name Colby is being used by 1873, not only because the town gets created at the end of 1873-74. I'm a little unsure about the time, specifically in Clark County. I'm not sure about the chronology. We don't have as great records, but it is 1873-74, officially 74 when Hull gets created. But they are using the name in 73, 74 for the township. And more to the point, this is from the Wisconsin Blue Book in 1874. But this is actually from the official records at the end of 1873. And they show that indeed there is a post office being listed in Clark County by the name Colby. So the name gets used, and that gives us an indication of like there are people living here, right? So we have a village that pops up, except it's not really a village. This picture is from 1909 or so, so it probably, oh, actually it is 1909. I didn't realize this was actually explicitly dated. This is also taken by, to be more confusing, James Colby, a picture of the community of Colby. But anyway, a little village emerges. And this is kind of a colloquial sense. They're calling it a village. This does not mean that they are incorporated as an entity, as a village, as, you know, that sort of thing. But it is a community, right? And the streets are laid out. There's a community there. This is a newspaper article from 1874 talking about a notable guy, formerly of Stevens Point, who goes over to this new place called Colby, David Keene. Yeah, and it's, okay, it's an interesting little insight, right? It's a piece of land on the line of the Wisconsin Central Railroad, 50 miles from Stevens Point. Settlers commenced to flock around him, and already the stillness of nature has given place to a smart village called Colby. The village now contains 150 families, 3 stores, a restaurant, 2 hotels, a flour and feed store, a meat market, 2 boot and shoe shops, a clothes pin factory, a shingle mill, sawmills in full operation, and a good depot building. A building is now being erected for a drugstore, and other acquisitions are in contemplation. The country around Colby possesses good soil, good water, good timber, and in short, everything that goes to make up a rich country when once developed. So there's a lot of potential here, and there's a good reason why Colby becomes sort of the community around which this growing, particularly lumbering, and then not long after that, the homesteads and the farming that emerge after that. And Colby becomes kind of the main thing. And I mean, look at this, all these people showing up. Granted, this is a free show, but this is market day. Kind of just an excuse to throw a couple postcards in here. And yet, it is, you know, this is also that same day. There's a sense of division, though, which is interesting, right? Because there's a big open field. Let's talk about that nature of it, right? Actually, first, it's growing, but not without some friction. So here's a fun thing. In 1883, again, looking at the post office listing for the Wisconsin Blue Books showing this, they are noting that their Colby post office is in Marathon, not in Clark County. The line didn't move. So did they move it to from Clark County to Marathon County? Well, let's look at the next one, 1885. Oh, interesting. There is a East Colby in Marathon and a Colby in Clark County. Huh, what's that about? Well, taking from, again, this book, this is the section where they're talking about the post office. They note that in 1883, the citizens were convinced with the increasing growth of Colby would come the necessity of increased post office facilities. So a rival petition was circulated. Thus was created or sorry, so again, a petition was circulated. Thus was created another rival office designated as East Colby, with H.J. Blanchard as postmaster, who said he would sell letter stamps at 2 cents each. But this doesn't last. Again, 1885. I think let's go back before I get to that. I think what happened here, and I'm reading between the lines, so I could be wrong, but this seems to be the case. Because of the dual nature of the village of Colby, which is not even a village at this point. I think they incorporated it as a village around 1884, 85. Because of the nature of this being a community, Marathon County folks, hey, the post office sort of for the state went, oh yeah, Marathon Colby, sure, that makes sense. But they didn't get rid of the one in Clark County, and so it was kind of like misunderstood what the situation was. And because of a clerical error, they did have two official post offices in Colby for a little bit. But they note again, by 1885, I'm going to skip over the people who are appointed here, but the previous June 29th in 1884, the office of East Colby was abolished. It had proved to be a source of inconvenience. So kind of interesting to see that, although for the most part, I think the community does emerge. Speaking of being a village, this is just an interesting point. In 1882, it's not a village. It's not incorporated as a corporate entity. It is still just a place, right? So here in the Marathon County, the town of Hull, although they do make a point on the plat map of showing Colby as a place, it's not an entity in a sort of municipal sense. This is just indicating that like this gets too complicated to try to sort out. This does not mean that there's like an addition of the village of Colby. I'm pretty sure. This just means that the county plat map workers were like, it's going to be too complicated to sort this out, so we're just going to make that look that way. By 1885, though, so this is the state of Wisconsin did a interdecennial. Okay. The federal government does a census of the population every 10 years, right? If it ends in a zero, so like we just did one in 2020, we'll do another one in 2023 or 2030. In 1885, though, it was up to individual states often, especially during this period of growth, they would do every 5 years in between the state federal censuses, they would do their own state census. And this is from the Blue Book showing some of the results. And they note that in Colby here, including 275 in the village. So this is talking about the town of Colby in Clark County, but they make a point of saying that there is a village. Now, I don't know if this means that this is like explicit, because if we look, oh yeah, there we go. If we look at Marathon County, they don't list Colby at all. So maybe they're a village. I honestly can't find any. This gets down to the difficulty of like, they're calling it a village very colloquially, but is it incorporated as such as a village? Unclear. Normally that would be the case. You'd become a village and then you'd become a city. But it's entirely possible that they were just not a designated place yet, until 1891. So here's a little bit of a story here. So this is a newspaper clipping talking about a session in February, I think 12th. That's what I put down, at least. In 1891, where they noted that Senator McBride, who is from Neilsville and happened to be the head of the Incorporation Committee, the City Incorporation Committee at the state legislature, he offered a bill incorporating the city of Colby in Clark and Marathon counties. This is an interesting thing. The following year in 1892, they are going to amend the procedure to make the process of becoming a city not start in the Senate or the Assembly, but start locally, and then you could petition to become a city, which is how most of the cities in this area end up becoming this. But McBride not only puts forward, well, actually, he doesn't put forward the other one, but it's during his time as the chairman that not only does Colby get forward, but also Greenwood does as well, both in his home of Clark County. But see, just showing here, so by March 25th that same year, 1891, Governor Peck is returning. This is basically saying what I believe this is when he signs a bunch of things. He returns some things with a veto. He agrees with some things and signs them into law, including at the very bottom here, incorporating the city of Colby. Now, as I said, Greenwood is also put forth as a possibility and also becomes a city in 1891. This is from around the same time. I can't, again, the newspaper records are pretty scant and I didn't go to like the official record, but I believe they didn't actually sign into law incorporating the city until maybe a couple weeks or months later, the next session. So technically, again, just as it definitely is the second city to be incorporated in Marathon County, I'm pretty sure after Neillsville, it is the second city in Clark County as well. It's alphabetical anyway, so hey, it's close enough. So we have this interesting situation. It's incorporated as a city, an entity in both Marathon and Clark counties. It's made wondering, how is this usual? Is this usually how this works? I mean, not always, right? Most cities and villages aren't. Well, as it turns out, I did some digging. There are 190 cities in Wisconsin, of which these 24, and there are 24 of them, that exist in more than one county. So they exist in two, or in the case of like Milwaukee's too complicated, I think. So it's, I think, in three or four of them. Pretty cool. So it's like, I think 12 point something percent, 13 point percent of the total cities are sharing. And most of them are not quite like Colby, where they are incorporated and start their life in both counties. Some of them do. Most of them, though, let's look at Marshfield as an example, right? Let's look at the city of Marshfield. So here's a modern map showing the alderman districts and voting wards. Well, there's a line here. Marathon County and Wood County. Marshfield starts, it's another one of these railroad towns, 1871. The railroad goes through, 1872, the community gets its start. And in the process, they are firmly in Wood County. But cities and villages have this thing called home rule, which means that unlike towns, unlike counties, counties kind of have their own home rule, but it's a different situation. But a city, as it grows, can annex adjacent land. A village can do this too. The towns can't. Doesn't matter how big a town is. In fact, the larger the town, more population, you tend to do the opposite. Instead of, like, same thing with counties, right? It doesn't matter whether Marathon County has 50 people or 50 million people. You're not going to just, take a couple townships from Lincoln County to accommodate that. Instead, what they would probably do is they would divvy it down to make it more manageable, to make 2 or more counties if there's 50 million people living here, which obviously there isn't. Anyway, point is, as the city of Marshfield grows, it annexes land, and as it goes northward, eventually it crosses over into Marathon County. And so there is a section of the town of, or city of Marshfield, which is in Marathon County, right? And this is typically how this works. You start in one county, as these cities grow, they sprawl, and as they sprawl, they go into another county. Colby doesn't have that situation in the same way. Abbotsford, similarly, kind of started there. Abbotsford, Dorchester are mostly on the western side of the county divide, but Colby, at least in the beginning, is right down the middle, right? Clark County, Marathon County. And the railway is right down the county line. They have this nice little divide, I think partially for more than just clerical reasons to figure out who's on what side of the county line, but it also does make it pretty clear. This brings up an interesting question, right? This might seem kind of direct, but I promise you, doing the research for this, I had a moment where I was like, what is a county? What does it mean to be in multiple counties? Does it matter? Does being a city and having home rule and having their own agency and sort of the ability to do things mean that it doesn't matter? Because Colby is part of Marathon County, but it also isn't. And not just because it's in Clark County. And this brings up an interesting question. So let's look at like the ways that a county exists and what it actually does to see how that relates to Colby. So the first thing that we can talk about is the county provides a very nice way to divide the population as a civic division, right? So for example, this is probably best illustrated with like census records, right? If you're going to take a population to figure out who's living where, you're going to want to know how many people are in this county versus this county. And so that's going to be important. Also important for elections, right? So for example, here are some statistics. This is about 5 years, 6 years after Colby becomes a city. And we can see this is just a 9th congressional district election. So there's an election that happens. This is an off year for like presidential or whatever. Yeah, I think so. There's 2 Colbys. It lists Clark County has the west ward of the city of Colby, and Marathon County has the east ward. Now, this is not always going to be the same. As the city grows, the wards evolve. If we jump forward about 40 years to 1937, you see the system where in Clark County we have two wards, the second and third. And although they don't explicitly say the first ward would remain in Colby. Just as a note, this is just a primary election, which is why there's not too much of a turnout in the city of Colby that is representative during this particular election. Now, this actually continues for the most part until I think the 80s and 90s, the 1980s and 90s, with the reconsolidation and sort of rethinking of how county boards work and sort of representation. I believe it's at this point that the city of Colby decides to restructure their wards. They still have 3 wards, but I don't believe that they are divided 1-2. They're more of that way. Yeah. So again, and I guess I didn't say it, this is important because you want to make sure that if you voted in the city of Colby, the Clark County statistics don't just kind of say, City of Colby, that's not us, that's its own thing. Marathon County, same way. You want to make sure that everybody's vote gets counted, but we also want to make sure that the vote gets counted once. So a county is a nice way to make that division. It adds extra complexity to the process, but again, they've been doing this long enough, 1891, this is just part of the process, right? And I could also be wrong about how this works. I'm definitely going to get some of this wrong. I don't have the time or the knowledge to necessarily get into the nitty and gritty, but I think we can very safely say that, so is a county, right? Counties first get established in Wisconsin back in 1818 when Michigan Territory. At this point, Illinois and Indiana get split off from the Northwest Territories, and we're left with the Michigan Territory, which exists mostly in Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota. By the time that we get split off into our own Wisconsin territory, Iowa is going to be kind of, and the rest of Minnesota will be kind of part of that, I believe. In 1818, though, the center of governance for all of this area is in Detroit. And naturally, while Detroit can make some big decisions about how the territory should function, it's going to be hard to actually enforce the rule of law in, say, what is going to be Wisconsin. And so what they decide to do is they decide to create 3 counties. Originally, it's just 3. By the time that we get split off into our own, there'll be a 4th one as Iowa gets kind of settled. But 3 counties. So there is Crawford, Brown, and then Mackinac. Mackinac? Something like that. And basically, the responsibilities of these places is collect taxes, keep law and order. And that means like having a sheriff maybe, or a constable or something. It also can mean just like court systems, like make sure that law and order is entailed. Now, as we move forward, of course, this is by the time we get statehood, 1846, 1849, 1850, 1864. So the counties are going to be added as we become state, as we become, doing all of this. But the same kind of principles apply, right? Counties become sort of decentralization for the sort of things that you want the local people to have authority over. And you don't want necessarily, say, the folks in Madison, dictating, what the policy on how wide the sidewalk has to be in the village of Edgar. Like, no, Edgar can figure that out, right? Or the county can figure that. That's a bad example because that is specifically in a municipality. Villages and cities, of course, have their own sort of responsibilities as well. But there is still some things in the city of Colby that, for example, let me pull up. Well, see, here they are. Still that strip. That's why I ended up. It's not completely the way it is, but I forgot that I was going to bring that up. Anyway, I looked through City of Colby and their municipal ordinances, which they have online. Now, this isn't every single thing that they've spilled out, but it's the basic thing. For the most part, the rule is, hey, if you're in the city of Colby and there's a rule that applies to you, follow that rule. If there is also a rule for a county that is in Marathon County or Clark County, if you're in one of those counties, follow those rules. If they're not, conflicted by in the same way that like you follow the state law and you also follow the national laws, like there are levels to that, right? The only time that I could find in all of this I could be wrong, I just kind of skimmed through most of it, But when it comes to the emergency government, this is just a fun fact, I guess. If there's a situation where there's a joint defense plan and organization, right, that they adopted, and as part of that, if there's an emergency, there's like a foreign invasion, or there is a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, and you need to have somebody local step up and take over authority to make sure that you can direct things. They decide that the overall suspension, if there's a conflict, we're going to default to the Marathon County Emergency Government Director. And other than that, there's not a lot of like, hey, there still are instances where it might matter what side of the county line you're on. But again, they've been doing this long enough that the county as governance, as a government, is in flux, and especially in a different way. I mean, it's similar. Like the city of Mosinee has a similar situation, right? You follow the city ordinances, and then there might also be some things to keep track of. Lastly, I think there's also something to be said about the county as being a social division. And this doesn't maybe apply as strongly to in other ways, but for example, as a historical society, there is a Clark County Historical Society and there's a Marathon County Historical Society. So for a long time, I was kind of like, well, the county line is the divide. So does that mean that I don't have to talk about Dorchester? Is that just because most of it's in Clark County, that's their responsibility, or is it ours? And like with the governance, like with a lot of stuff, we just kind of sort it out, right? Talk if there's something that's relevant that we need to keep track of. We don't do as good of a job as we probably should, but I mean, this is an example, right? Like a lot of stuff, like our purview is not an official government mandate necessarily to say that like, oh, the county line, we're not allowed to collect something that's 2 blocks away from that railroad where the line was in Colby. Like the city of Colby is still part of the area that we want to make sure history is being developed and maintained. And thankfully, Colby Rural Arts Museum is a great example of folks who locally are keeping that history alive, and the public library and things. And we have a little bit here and there. I think Neilsville has a little bit here and there for the county. And in that way, it's a little bit more complicated than maybe, say, just census information is pretty straightforward. But I don't know. I guess I point all this out just to say that, like, oh, and also, admittedly, I think to the average person, it's not like, growing up in this, like the city of Colby and where you went to the high school, like that has a lot more attachment than say, oh yeah, I'm a Marathon County. Like for whatever reason, the counties aren't really like a major social division for identity in the same way that like being an American or a Wisconsinite or, being from Colby is, but it is still a thing. So kind of interesting to kind of consider. And there's probably other examples. This is obviously the one that sticks out, and the one that I wanted to talk about just because, it's an interesting point, and something that I have been contemplating recently. And maybe if it's something that was confusing to me, like I don't remember them going over the difference between cities and, county administration when I was in 5th grade taking civics class. And I think I did pretty well in that class. So if I am struggling with these definitions, and maybe you are too, and maybe you learned a little bit. And hopefully I was accurate in it, as much of this as I could. It gets complicated. Anyway, I think that's probably good. I can maybe, I was going to, off chance that anybody has corrected me or shared anything. So next week we're in a bit of an interesting situation. This is normally where I would tell you about what we're doing next week. I am going to be in La Crosse for the local history and historic preservation conference, which we have every year. So I may not be here to do this. I might record something. We might do a rerun. We'll see. But the following week, Gary has been working on a program that probably won't be ready to record by like Tuesday when I have to leave. But we'll pick that up next week, where we're actually gonna like take a bit of a road trip through the county. If we go from Colby and we kind of drive eastward on County Road N, I think it's N, Yeah, what do you see? What are some of the things that you'll come across, and just kind of some highlights of the history of that area, and it's something we're gonna try, which should be kind of fun. So anyway, I think that brings us to the end. Thanks for watching, as always. If you're still watching, always appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something, and yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next time for